Good morning. Good morning. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. On behalf of the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies at the University of Alberta, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's online conference. War Did Not End, the Ex-Yugoslavia 3 decades later, commemorating the beginning of the decade-long Yugoslav wars and the process of dissolution of the former Yugoslavia and the legacy of that. My name is Alexander Carpenter. I'm the director of the Wirth Institute. The Wirth Institute was founded in 1998 as the Canadian Centre for Austrian and Central European Studies. In 2003, it was renamed in recognition of the generous endowment provided by Dr. Manfred and Dr. Alfred Wirth. The Institute is the leading centre for Central European Studies in Canada and engages in a robust program of scholarly, cultural, and community activities on the local, national, and international level. I've been asked to offer some brief introductory remarks as a preface to today's very interesting and diverse paper presentations, which I note range in topic from cultural history, memory and myth, to national identity, reconciliation, to relationships between the European Union and the Balkans. Before we go any further, I would just like to acknowledge Rachel Wright, the Wirth Institute's communication specialist, for facilitating today's online activities, and without Rachel's efforts, as always, this virtual get-together would not have been possible. And I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Dr. Srdja Pavlovic for proposing and organizing this event in the first place, and just like to say it has been a pleasure working with him, and I'm looking forward to future collaborations. I'm particularly pleased to be participating, if only a host in this conference, not only because it so nicely and obviously falls within the ambit of the Wirth Institute's geographical mandate, but because, to be quite frank, as the newly installed director of the Wirth Institute, I know quite little about the former Yugoslavia, the conflict under discussion today, and the Balkan region in general. My own research focuses on Austrian musical, cultural, and intellectual history. My knowledge of Yugoslavia is limited as a scholar and a citizen to what I encountered tangentially in my primary research pursuits, and to what I might glean from the news within the broader context of having an interest in global issues. But it occurred to me just a few days ago that I do have a connection to this topic, that is to the Yugoslav war and its legacy, a family connection, in fact, that I hadn't thought about, but my cousin, my first cousin, was a Canadian peacekeeper during the war, and he served a number of tours. And in thinking about this symposium and reflecting on his involvement, I realized not only how little I know about the region, its history, its people, its treasures, its tensions, and its troubles, but also that I've never spoken to him about his experiences, and he is himself now a military historian. And his own personal experiences are augmented by the copious photographic and documentary records that he has at his disposal. So I'll take this opportunity to publicly chastise myself as a historian for not having the curiosity to have pursued this in the past. But I'll also take the opportunity to pledge for the future, and especially as director of the Wirth Institute, to grow my knowledge of our institute's 2 Balkan countries, Croatia and Slovenia, and also of the Balkans in general. And I look very forward to today's symposium as a valuable step in that education. And again, I'd like to thank Dr. Pavlovic and all of you, today's speakers, for the opportunity to participate. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Srdja if we haven't lost him again. Give him a moment, perhaps, to recover from his glitch. Failing Srdja's return, Perhaps we can improvise then and begin the first session. And that falls then on Dr. Nielsen to launch our first session, if you're ready.
I am. However, I believe that I'm supposed to follow after Eric Gordy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. Of course, Dr. Gordy, for the opening keynote, if you would.
Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to see so many friends here. Christian, if you want to talk instead of me, that would be fine. Really, I don't mind. And I'm very pleased that Srdja will never find out what kind of talk I wrote for his conference. So let me first and step back a little bit from the kind of bombastic title that I gave to the talk. This was something I thought of at the last minute, but I do want to talk about studies of the region. I mean, academic approaches to the region and some other approaches that are not academic, and try to tell a little bit of a story, give a little bit of diagnosis of research on the area. So this might be understood as a little bit of academic self-criticism, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. And I am also going to try to tell this story without mentioning very many names. I think if I give this the way that I wrote it, I will mention only one name in the whole presentation, and that will be the name of Max Weber, who is not able to reply to me. And that's because I want this to be a discussion of issues, of questions of how we frame research rather than an exercise in gossip. And I suppose I might as well recognize at the beginning what I'm about to say. It is a little bit polemical, so I apologize for this in advance. Here is what I'm thinking, that if we want to talk about where studies of the Balkans are, we want to talk about where they come from. And I think if you go back to the earliest studies of the Balkans that this will be different studies for different people, but as far back as you can go, you're going to find a set of consistent themes emerging, right? I mean, if we're talking about research in the modern period, one of those themes is the rapid urbanization and modernization of the region and depopulation of the countryside. But really the dominant themes, especially if you look at some of the most popular literature, they focus on a kind of exoticism, on the construction and elaboration of the status of the region as a borderland. They focus especially in the period after the First World War and thereafter to the problem of contrasting traditions and legacies. So this idea of the Balkan as a meeting place that is sometimes happy and is sometimes tense has been with us, I think, for as long as we've had anything that we can call studies of the region. And probably the dominant approach to this problematic most of the time has been to adopt the conventional perspective and argue, as so many people have, that the existence of difference in history and culture and some other factors, religion, language, and so on, made for an unsustainable state. But I do want to underline, this was not the only approach that was offered. There was a not inconsiderable current of celebration, of magnifying the considerable beauty and the potential of what was called the meeting of the East and West. And this was something that was continued in the Cold War era with what might have been excessive, but nonetheless was there, the glorification of the third path between the two global blocs. I think if you look at the pre-war, I mean pre-most recent wars, discussions of these kinds of issues, you could already tell ahead of time who among the people doing this kind of writing was going to become an apologist for new regimes, that legitimated themselves according to a principle of ethnicity, and who would become, as the term would later be used, Yugo-nostalgic. Now, we might as well skip the criticism of people who became apologists for ethnic monopolists. This criticism is obvious and it's already been done. I think that we can make a critical point about Yugo-nostalgics, and that is that they deliberately overlooked a number of questions that turned out to be important later on. Not just authoritarianism in politics and the absence of a deep network of institutions that would continue to function as the legitimacy of the League of Communists eroded, but also inequality and the development of a social order that relied excessively on surveillance, militarization, and securitization, and to the degree that the security sector became an interest group making claims on privilege that rivaled claims made by citizen-based political actors. So this sets the scene. Then in the 1990s comes the violence. And as it always does, violence brought with it some new arrivals seeking publicity and position who were not deeply familiar with the environment. And they received a lot of publicity. Who were these new arrivals? I am now going to show you a slide. I think I'm going to show you a slide. There, am I showing you a slide? So who are these new arrivals? I think we could probably put together a typology dividing them into 5 parts. First, 2 kinds of opportunists. The first kind, opportunists with claims based in the past. So many of these are people who were in some sort of close or sometimes not so close relationship with the post-World War II political diaspora. Some people did not have close relationships with this diaspora, but established them later. Some of them had a kind of tangential relationship to a community of so-called dissidents from the state socialist period, and function, we could probably argue in the 1990s, as a kind of lasting legacy of the incoherence of much of the anti-state politics of the earlier period. And these were people who saw states emerging that legitimated themselves according to principles of nationality. They claimed these states as their own, and they sought ways to derive benefit from these states at the expense of the local populations. Second kind of opportunists, or opportunists with claims based in ideology. And here, we don't only have the obvious foundations of deployment of global anti-communism, for example, or revival of religion. We saw the formation of alliances between groups from the emerging ethnifying elites and internationals whose interest was not in the people or societies of the region, but in making an unrelated point, usually one that would be related to the environment where they lived. Some of the time this was a point about gender, some of the time it was about imperialism, some of the time it was about who was a pure Marxist or not. These people received benefit from the situation in the form of publicity, and the occasional member of this group would eventually receive a Nobel Prize. The next group you had are what we could call the discursive equivalent of ambulance chasers. Sorry, I told you this would be polemical. These were people mostly concentrated in media, but there were more than a few in academics, and there's not a lot to be said about them, except that these are people who follow along and sometimes contribute to outrages. And when outrages move their focus of concentration to another place, they move to that place. Then we have the group of political and security entrepreneurs. This is a group of people placed in institutional locations like the foreign ministries of powerful states or in international organizations. People who have little experience with, knowledge of, or feeling for the place where they are working, but who achieve prominence in this place by taking on a role in negotiations and other types of political exchanges. And these people, by the time their personal memoirs have become a secondary source for historical analysis, they've generally moved on to other things, with a small number of exceptions. And the final group of new arrivals, we could call the do-gooders who weren't doing good. Now here, I don't want to say anything bad about the motivations of do-gooders. I think that their motivations are good, as indicated by the name. What I'd suggest is this, that a number of very good causes were advanced, were funded, and were promoted, both during the period of violence and after it in the region, and not a lot of them have survived. Their short survival is an indication of just how much they depended on material and organizational support from outside, and how quickly the providers of this support lost interest and moved elsewhere. It would be reassuring to say that the causes that had significant domestic clienteles did survive, but in many instances, this is not the case. Do-gooders who establish relationships of dependency with the done good tos can end up intentionally, I think, doing not good. Let me stop the screen share now. Stop share. And say each of these new and temporary arrivals had some kind of influence, and we can be critical of that influence, but we probably have to understand the phenomenon of new arrivals as something that unavoidably happens when a set of events becomes a prominent topic in international news. The parachutists landed in the region, and after a short time there, flew out. What about the professionals, the people who dedicated their lives to the region? Let's say at the beginning that this is a group of people who were faced with a situation that nobody hopes to find themselves in which the field of study that they had participated in for a lifetime, in which for a lifetime it offered a source of meaning and pleasure for them, becomes an arena of conflict and contestation, not free of danger. At the same time, this field then became a terrain of perverse opportunity where people could gain prominence, most often at the cost of their credibility. What were some of the bad opportunities taken? Back to the screen share. And so let me speak critically about the things that scholars in working in the region did that were bad. The first of them is a bit counterintuitive. That is, there are the people who stayed out of the fight, and they stayed very far out of the fight. That is, we're starting with the negation of the negation. A lot of the critique that I'll be offering about academics is directed to people who became too involved, but there are also people who got not involved at all, or people who retreated into the heights of theoretical and structural analysis. And this had the effect of dissolving the events that they were discussing into a kind of massive global fog. In the worst cases, it led to the complete disappearance of social actors into hypotheses like the end of history or the clash of civilizations, or a number of cod philosophical theses about the origins of ethnic nationalism in ancient history or nature. The second type of scholarly bad faith was the opposite. That is, the people choosing a side, in which sides are understood to be constituted by parties in power that are practicing violence. There was so much of this that it seems almost pointless to offer examples, and the reasons why it is wrong are both plentiful and possibly too obvious to discuss. If I were pressed to identify a reason as to why it is wrong, what stands out is that this form of advocacy requires a posture that is opposed to the basic spirit of research, ignoring or misrepresenting facts for the purpose of advancing a theory. So the people who participated in this showed a strong tendency, interestingly, to justify their involvement with reference to ideas about morality or moral superiority, to universal ideas. And the third kind of scholarly bad faith I would underline would be the people who imported to the region values and standards that did not exist in the markets where they were produced. And this is a phenomenon, I think, especially of the post-conflict period, but it's also characteristic of the overall ideological framework that came to be called under the label transition. It's an approach that is, at first glance, high-minded. It postulates the perfect justice, the perfect memory, the perfect democracy, the perfect confrontation with the past. And one fault with it is that it postulates standards for these categories that are not practiced or realized in the states from which the standards originate. Another fault of this is that it tends to establish a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure by imposing goals which in reality can never be achieved. And it presages damage then to the societies involved by constructing these unachievable goals as benchmarks. So having trashed my distinguished and much loved academic colleagues, I'll say this. I'd say that a consequence of this type of bad faith is that a body of analysis was produced in the 1990s, which, while in many cases it remains influential, answers very few questions and provides very few guides for research. And it also has some long-term effects that constitute barriers to understanding. The first of these is that it reifies the conflict boundaries of the 1990s as the framework for all discussion of the region into the future. The second thing it does is it privileges actors within the ranks of ethnifying elites, validating the claims of these actors to be exclusive and legitimate representatives of ethnically defined peoples. And the third thing that it does, and this is, I think, visible in the present, it creates a toxic atmosphere, especially for early career researchers who face the pressure to be aligned with the lobby and constant dismissals then from the lobbies of which they are not members. So my diagnosis of the academics of the 1990s is negative, that in many instances, academics brought the war home to themselves, extended it to infinite length, and poisoned the sweet rakia that made their lives so rich at the confluence of East and West. This would be a bad enough thing for people to do to themselves, but what makes it bad is that they did it to the generations that followed. I name myself, and I think the people at this meeting and all of our students as part of the generations that followed. And I'd suggest that it's the job of the generation that that follows this to pick up the pieces. How do we do it? Let me offer you some guidelines, and I am going to share the screen again. Here are some points that I hope might be useful points for the way forward to build back Balkan studies better, build back better. The first, engage the societies. That is to say, one thing that the people that I've just had not very nice things to say about, the temporary arrivals and the aligned academics, had in common is that they identified with states. They talked in terms of states, which they equated with populations. And what this meant is that, with very rare exceptions, there was not very much discussion of societies and the complexity of societies. This is a challenge that I believe, thankfully, has been taken up with a great deal of energy by researchers who began their research careers in the last 20 years. The second point I would offer on the way forward is find a spot with a view above East and West, and not just above East and West, but also beyond contending ethno-national groups. That is to say, we tend to refer back to fault lines in legacy conflict, as the conflicts of the 1990s were, or external interpretations of political conflict, like competition between East and West is. The fault lines that may have been important at one time are not fixed in place to be the principal fault lines that extend into the indefinite future. And what we probably need to do is look at fault lines that are developing and emergent, that is, to develop approaches to contestation and competition within these societies that derive from understandings of what the conflicts are about from empirical observation of the facts on the ground, rather than from categories that are made for us in advance. The third point that I would offer as a way forward is share the wealth. That is, this is a point that is directed in the first instance toward international researchers. We have as a group always relied very heavily and with a good deal of gratitude on the work of domestic researchers. And the most outstanding of these domestic researchers, as we know from experience, have tended to be compelled to do their work without a great deal of support and with a great deal of resistance. we are responsible to the people on whose work we draw, and we are also responsible to the emerging group of researchers on whose work we will draw in the future. So publish them, include them on your grants, advise them on professional development, develop their capacity, and don't be afraid to take positions in projects or wherever where you will be subordinate to them. The fourth point, don't be afraid of multiplicity. I think it is not difficult to understand why people tend to prefer the company of like-minded people, both in leisure and in work. What I'll suggest is we should try to replace the term like-minded with like-impulsed. That it's to say that the people who agree with us have a fault, and they have the fault of having already made up their minds. And what we want to pursue is the development of new and original perspectives based on lived experience and experience on the ground that do not yet inform our approaches to the field, but might inform them in the future. And then the final point is an obvious point, and I will not talk about it very much. Have we rendered unto Caesar? We have rendered enough. And our purpose as academics is not to produce propaganda. Enough of that gets produced without our help. I say this is a point that does not need much elaboration, but we get a lot of pressure around it. So these are my pointers and guidelines for an orientation to the future. I think in short, what it means is that we rebuild the world of research that political conflict took away from us by being primarily researchers. Now, does this mean that we cannot be politically engaged? Certainly it does not. I think most of us are animated by very passionately held political understandings of the region, by values that we take seriously, and by very strong attachments and commitments having to do with large questions like memory, justice, equality, democracy, peace. And it would be both irresponsible and probably impossible to run away from these obligations. Most of us are probably also reasonably well persuaded, whether evidence supports this view or not, that it is useful and good to share the knowledge and understanding that we have developed through research with people who are in a position to make policy, even if it seems like they do not listen to this advice very often, and that we have a positive obligation to do this. I think what it does mean instead is that we don't want to confuse our political orientations with knowledge, or to place them before knowledge in a way that compels us to alter facts in order to fit an approach we've conceived in advance. And I think that this is what Max Weber had in mind in his classic and always relevant essay, Science as a Vocation, when he argues about academic prophecy and about the need for the scientist to maintain a distance from politics, or to promote systems of belief, arguing that it can create only fanatical sects but never a genuine community. I think our goal is to recapture something that probably existed in the period before violence, was probably lost in the period during violence, and that's a community committed to understanding and knowledge. And with that, I'll thank you for your indulgence of my outrageous views, and for your time and your patience. And I hope that we've left enough time for all of the discussion that people want to do.
Thank you, Professor Gordy. I do apologize to everyone for my bad internet connection, and I missed the initial introduction of our keynote speaker. I'm blaming Bill Gates for this. I would like to open the discussion amongst the panelists to begin with, following Professor Gordy's very interesting and inspiring presentation. To start off the series of questions, I was just wondering if Professor Gordy would be kind enough to elaborate a bit more on the issue of academic engagement in these political discourses and ideologies and propaganda being typical for the Balkan historians, and the possibility of maybe locating similar type of academic activity and engagement elsewhere at different periods. And I'm specifically thinking about the Cold War academic engagement in Europe vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and China.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The Cold War is certainly an example, and based as I am in London, I think you can still see some signs and traces in approaches to the region of a conflict that was probably the dominant conflict among scholars 100 years ago concerned with the region, and that is between the scholars who are sympathetic to Greece and the scholars who are sympathetic to Turkey. So it's certainly not unique. I'd say maybe one thing that could be relatively unique when we're talking about the region that we work with is that because of the instability of the situation, we still have the potential to put people into danger through our interventions, and that's why I wanted to talk about this question in particular today, without meaning to sound alarmist. That sounded alarmist, didn't it?
Thank you, Professor Gordy. I invite the panelists to entertain their questions. Professor Malešević, yes.
Thanks very much, Eric, for this criticism of all of us, I think, included as well. Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, obviously, I'm a very much a Weberian scholar in many respects and tried to be, but Weber himself, as you know, did preach one thing and was also German nationalist on the other hand, and although he evolved after after the experience of the First World War. What I want to if you could tell us a little bit more about this kind of focus on society, which I think is very important, and I think a lot what you're saying about this kind of ethnification of analysis, which has been dominant really from 90s, and maybe we had a certain period in maybe 10 years ago when there was more research done internally, what's happening within societies. And then I have a feeling we've shifted again to where we were immediately after the war. So being sociologists, you could tell us a little bit more what kind of practical research you had in mind when you said the category of societies.
Yeah, because I mean, I think as a general point, I mean, at the risk of repeating myself, I think a lot of the time when you are looking at a society from outside, there's a temptation to say things about it that you would never say about the society that you're living in. I mean, especially this kind of flattening that that says that all of the people in the society are the same. And I think the fields for research that seem to be emerging now, I mean, I think we really do need to understand a lot more about the new forms of inequality that are developing as states become more privatized, and there is good work on this, but I think that there's a good deal of it that makes the mistake of tying new forms of inequality to legacies of socialism. And we're at the point now where many of them are not legacies of socialism. I think, I mean, in addition to looking at understanding diversity within the societies that we're looking at, I think there's really been insufficient attention to phenomena that cross political and ethnic and national borders. So that, for example, right now, in all of the states of the region, there is no exception. You have fairly broadly based protest movements developing against the consequences of international investment that will have major environmental effects. I mean, there's no state where you haven't seen some kind of problem and a movement responding to it with these characteristics. And there, I mean, especially since, you know, people love to take nationalism and project it back onto nature, why don't we talk about something that's really nature? Because questions like the effect of mining or power generation on air and water really are problems that affect people across whole groups and of all groups, and they do it exactly in the same way, whether the people breathing the bad air are Albanian or Macedonian or Croatian or whatever.
Thank you, Professor Gordy. Dr. Garcevic, please.
Good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everybody. First of all, to make it clear, I'm not a doctor. I'm a practitioner here, and I found myself in a good company of professors and academics. Since I have another event taking place right now, I have to leave shortly, but I would like to ask Professor Gordy a question. You know, you made a reference to people who are, as you said, good doers but don't making good, or people with good intentions but not making good. Tell me, I would like to maybe hear more in specifics who those people are. How do you see them? Do you refer to followers, or do you think to who are actively involved in events, maybe not necessarily with bad intentions, but at the end of the day, their action doesn't make good?
I mean, okay, I don't want to name names or particular organizations or anything. Like I'd do that if we were in a bar, but not in this environment. But I'd say, I mean, in terms of this kind of high-minded and charitable international intervention, I absolutely am not critical of the motivations of people who engage in it. I think it is done with the best of intentions. But fundamentally, I would offer two criticisms. And the first criticism is that they engage with too narrow a circle of people. So we've seen this pattern with a lot of international NGO intervention, for example, where a group of people is recruited who go around from meeting to meeting and talk to each other without engaging the public. So that's the first criticism. And the second criticism is that they come but they don't stay, which means that programs are started to do things. I mean, like to promote gender equality. Of course, all of us support gender equality. You can't be opposed to that. But 2 years of promoting gender equality followed by nothing is not going to achieve it, and can sadly sometimes have the opposite consequences. Now, you could say in response to this that it was the responsibility of the local citizens to carry on where international intervention started the movement. But I think that sometimes the degree to which international intervention is well organized and well financed has the perverse consequence of discouraging that kind of development.
If no one is talking, then can I join in the discussion?
Yes, of course. I do apologize to everyone. My internet connection is very, very bad, so I'm in and out of it. Dr. Pavlovic, please continue.
Thanks, Srdja. Eric, thank you very much for this very thought-provoking and provocative presentation. I really could follow your classifications and even thinking of our colleagues, and also worrying about myself where I might be ending up there. But what I from reading and observing and knowing of the work that's being produced by colleagues, and also them being present either with their work or physically in the region, I also see damage that's not necessarily intentionally done, but it's caused there by the work, because especially those outsiders coming there, as you know, as you would know, Eric, local people are, very fond of people who have learned about their culture, their language, and then kind of the impact, that societal impact, which Sinisha and you discussed. It's usually reserved for some media appearance and self-promotion, rather than some kind of lasting and ongoing change and impact beyond kind of my scholarly work. And this has definitely affected also younger colleagues, those early career researchers, people also looking for PhD opportunities or higher degrees in other fields, so that these silos and kind of the colonial patterns are somehow being replicated, even though some of these colleagues would talk against it or would focus on I don't know, post-colonial conditions, while themselves not only embodying them, really replicating it through their work and their right. So I see that there's that damage, or there's lack of impact that we as academics through our work could be doing, while through our physical presence or through our works being cited, translated, and used in the region. So more comment and really a question.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, what can I say except that I absolutely agree with you completely. And I think that there's a problematic behind it, and that is that international researchers and international universities take on an especially important role because of the lack of willingness, or sometimes the fear, of domestic institutions in the states in the region to take on some questions. And it seems like this is something that that strategically, that this is a problem that we could try to take on together.
I think so. Thank you.
And thanks for staying awake long enough to ask to make the comment.
It's going to be a long night. A bit like Dayton,
Thank you, Harris and Eric. Thanks to both of you. Professor Velikina has a question. Please continue.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Professor Gordy, for this inspiring and critical keynote. I would like to ask you something that interests me very much and chases me, and this is the self-balkanization that happens also in the field of the Balkan academia, Balkan scholars. So can you say a little bit more? It's very much connected with what you do, and sometimes I have the impression, that now very similar, like, I don't know, blaxploitation in the Hollywood films, we can also face in academia this kind of Balkan exploitation, not only in the popular culture, not only in the popular science, but also in the academia as such. So maybe a few words, that in a way are just continuing what you were saying, maybe just deep a little bit more argument. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Mita, when you talk about self-balkanization, do you mean people making the assertion that they can't do things because of backwardness or something, or are you talking about divisions between scholars in the research community?
I mean in the academia as such, in the academic community, sometimes it's very easy to slip into the the condemnation of the Balkans that we hear outside. It's very difficult sometimes to resist that kind of views, And as much as we are fighting against it, it's slowly in a way, or it's, coming from all sides, and this is something that, really bothers me in a way. You know what I mean? It's danger that I don't see in many other, fields of research. And I don't know, I believe, if I can maybe say a little bit more about it from my perspective, the comparative element would be very, very important, to compare with the other, regions, other similar situations or less similar, but I see a kind of comparison as a kind of cure.
Yeah, well, comparison is good. I mean, I completely agree. I think that that stereotypes about the Balkans are one of the greatest barriers to understanding the Balkans, and this is true both inside and outside the region. It's probable that outsiders are more guilty than insiders, but insiders are not free of guilt. And what's interesting, I think, about this Balkan stereotype, what are the elements of it? The elements of it are, first of all, the image of backwardness. Second, the perception that there's an inclination toward authoritarianism and uniformity. And third, the idea that there are publics that are in some ways unaware or insufficiently educated. What I'd argue about all of these elements of the stereotype is that there is no society in the world you can go to, particularly democratic societies or societies hoping to be democratic, where people are not making this complaint, right? It's basically the structure of most arguments trying to offer an explanation for the rise of things like Donald Trump. The second point that I would make about balkanization, and this is one that in particular is an argument that comes more from inside than from outside, but it's this reproduction of the colonialist or imperialist model that views the Balkans as a periphery that is dominated by powerful operators from outside. And I suppose the answer to this is really, we could think of it as a type of false consciousness, in the sense that, if we want to emulate Wallerstein and divide the states and regions of the world into classes, the Balkans is not the lower class or the working class. They're somewhere in the middle. Like you look at global averages, they're pretty close. So it's lower than most of the European average, definitely higher than the average on some other continents. But these are states that are not powerless, not economically, and certainly not culturally or intellectually, as much as it may be convenient sometimes to say that they are. I'm not sure whether that answers a question. I think we could go on for a long time.
Yeah, it's an open topic, So, but thanks for your question, for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Velikonja. If panelists don't have any more questions, there is a question from one of our viewers and for Professor Gordy, and I would read it. It comes to us from Sven Milekic, and the question reads, thank you for a nice theoretical overview of academia working on Yugoslavia. Can you tell a bit more just how limited is the research focusing exclusively on ethnic groups? Is this simply an oversimplification, or are these research following the dominant ideological interpretation of the 1990s war and its aftermath, everything centered on ethnic groups as tightly connected ones? Professor Gordy, for you.
Okay, thanks. Hi Sven, how are you? For anybody who follows the media, then you know that everybody follows with great anticipation when will be the next article by Sven on political developments, especially in Croatia. I have sort of mixed feelings about ethnic groups and ethnic identities. I mean, because on the one hand, yeah, it's certain that they exist and can be made meaningful and are often made meaningful in a political context. In a sense, concentrating on ethnic identities and relations between them is not a mistake. This is a part of reality. I think what I would ask everybody to do is to think about their own identities. If somebody asks you, what is your nationality? Most of us eventually will have some kind of answer. Some of us might have more than one answer. If you ask any of us, what is your religion? Most of us will probably answer something, whether we're religious or not. That is, there's some religion in the world that chances are we identify with more than others. And if we ask when these things become important, it's when they're mobilized by situations. Otherwise, in everyday life, everybody has a multitude of identities, right? We have these ethnicities and religions, we have a gender, we have a profession, we belong to certain taste communities. I have heard rumors that there are people in the world who don't like jazz, but I don't believe it. And as all of these things are potential sources of identification and division, sometimes multiple ones at the same time. And if we really want to understand the way that mobilization happens, then we have to look to ways in which any of them can be mobilized. So my biggest criticism of the ethnicity fetish is that it makes the assumption in the beginning that the factor that is going to mobilize people is always going to be ethnicity. Is that an incomplete answer to your question, Sven?
Thank you, Professor Gordy. I wish also to thank you for the very enlightening presentation. And we have the second question from the audience. So Jesse Barton Kronesova writes, thanks, Eric. You spoke of the quote unquote older generation, but there also seem to be quite a lot of current debates when academics who try to introduce some more sensitive topics into the discussion are attacked and even publicly disbarred. I think linked to the uniformity that you discussed too, do you have any advice for early career scholars in particular who are interested in these topics, want to have an impact, but often fear of these attacks as they could really harm their research and their academic credentials? And before Professor Gordy answers, I just wanted to remind everyone that we are running on a rather tight schedule. So following this question, we will move to the next presentation. Thank you, Professor Gordy.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and on the topic of young researchers doing important research on sensitive topics, I think we have to mention Jesse's really excellent research on the needs of victims of violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, especially, and the way that these needs, even though internationally the effort has been to construct them mostly in symbolic terms, very often they are material needs that can be addressed by material means. And this is a question that people have avoided for years. And here there's really an emerging generation of people like Jesse, Srdja Lazic is another, and Daniela Lai, who are raising this question. Yeah, and then the question is about the fear of getting attacked. And I have to be honest and tell you that I'm not sure that I have very much that is helpful to say about this. I mean, if you tell a person to be persistent or to be courageous, this isn't really offering advice. It's sort of a backhanded way of insulting them. I mean, this is bound to affect people. It affects the confidence that you have in yourself. It affects the way that you feel. It affects sometimes future possibilities for professional development. And even though I am in a position where many of these effects are muted or sometimes even non-existent, I can't say that it's that it's not a feeling that is provoked. So I actually think about this fear of the creation of negative sentiment and bad feeling, that I really can't say anything helpful about it directly, but I might be able to say something about it indirectly, and that is that we really do have an opportunity to build and strengthen our networks of people in whom we trust. And there's a strong tendency, I know, among people, especially people in their early career, who are very concerned about the creativity and impact of research, to set aside a lot of questions like methodologies and consistent logics of inquiry and professional ethics. But this is something that I really need. We need to strengthen our networks and communities that are based on good methodologies and good professional ethics.
Thank you, Professor Gordy, and thanks again for a very enlightening keynote address. At this point, I would like to